We're so happy to have a chance to come before you to continue the examination of the various regions that are impacted by the expansion of the U.S. empire. We're going to be taking a look at what is under effect in Africa. Before we get into this, so let me just make a couple of quick comments as we sort of set the stage for our conversation. We're so happy that Ray McGovern made the comments he made. I think he framed what we have been articulating for quite some time in terms of one cannot completely understand the ease in which the authorities are able to persuade the American people to support war and aggression without understanding this concept of white supremacy, white supremacist ideology that stratifies human beings into those humans who have rights that should be respected, and those humans who make up the populations that are, in fact, killable. This whole notion of the right to protect or the responsibility to protect, the whole idea that the U.S. and the West has a right and a responsibility to determine the leadership of other peoples and other nations. Those assumptions are based on the fictitious notion that there's something called Western civilization that represents the apex of human development, and that Westerners have a right and a responsibility to determine how other people live. One of the things that defines what we are going to do this morning is the fact that our concern about Africa is not just limited to Africa, that part of the black radical tradition is our centeredness on internationalism. The fact that we recognize that as an oppressed people, subjected to not only racial oppression, but colonialism, that we had a responsibility to understand the world and to, in fact, link up with the world's struggling people. So at the center of the black radical tradition has been and is internationalism, which means that basically we stand in solidarity with all oppressed people. That's been at the center of everything we've done while we have been here in this country. So today we're going to focus on Africa and the invasion, or the reinvasion, if you will, of the African continent. We have a fact sheet that's been passed around that we prepared for this conversation today. We want to frame our conversation in such a way where we are going to present information, but we want to think about the information, think about the African continent in terms of how we're going to address the work of this coalition. It's important for us to also point out that this coalition, this campaign, should be seen as one component of the larger anti-war movement that we are attempting to try to revive and to strengthen. It's not going to take the place of the anti-war movement. That we should think of this as a campaign, and therefore as a campaign it becomes a tactic toward the larger objective of eliminating war and aggression and building toward peace. And part of that process is to dismantle empire. So let's keep that in mind as we go forward. We have a fantastic panel this morning. I'm going to introduce them. You have their bios already in the materials. We're not going to spend a lot of time on that. I will introduce them in the order that they're going to present. First, we have Netfa Freeman, who is an organizer with the Pan-African Community Association, Pan-African Community Action, one of the most dynamic groups in this country. He's also, in his professional capacity, he works at the IPS, the Institute for Policy Studies, as an analyst and also as an event coordinator. He will be followed by Margaret Kimberley, one of our great public intellectuals and activists here in this country. She is a writer and contributor to Black Agenda Report. She's also on the coordinating committee of the Black Alliance for Peace. She will be followed by Maurice, Carney, another longtime activist who is an organizer with the Friends of the Congo, someone who's been intimately involved in the situation on the African continent, who has been educating people on these issues for quite some time, really around the world. All of them are members of the Black Alliance for Peace. This wasn't done consciously. In fact, I wasn't even part of the panel. It just sort of happened that way, and I think that's a good thing. So let's welcome our panelists, and let's get started. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. As Ajamu said, my name is Netfa Freeman, and we want to say that PACA, we're known as PACA, we're a proud member of the Black Alliance for Peace, and as a Pan-Africanist organization, I'm going to start by saying it's common for Pan-Africanists to use interchangeably the terms Black and African. I mean, it just makes sense. And nothing else illustrates how much of an oxymoron or the oxymoronic nature of African American than is the disposition of this settler colony's occupation forces among Black people. So we're going to start with understanding that this is a settler colony. African people, Black people in this country are a domestic colony. We're a colony within this settler colony, and that's the position of Pan-African Community Action. We have to start there because in order to understand what we share in our analysis, if you don't start with that, everything else will confuse you. One of the things is that we see synonymous. We can actually see concretely. It's not just about embracing our culture and the things that we share in common, but actually the disposition, what we said, the disposition, how we are treated all over the world, how Black people are treated all over the world by the U.S. government determines that we are one people. It's not just because we are embracing our culture. We're actually treated this way. It's a material condition. From the mid-1950s on to the 70s, both Africa and the domestic colony of Africans in the United States were politically energized into liberation movements. We can see the independence movements in Africa, and many people were familiar with the Black Power movement and civil rights struggle within the United States. It pretty much was happening at the same time. And the response to both was from the United States, was through the FBI's COINTEL program and the subversion of our organizations and our movements here, and its counterpart, the CIA, was also engaged in the same response to our movements in Africa through the coups d'etats, like in Ghana and in the Congo, and we can name it. And so a lot of times we look at history and we look at things like that in such a siloed way, we don't see that they are operating in tandem with each other in that sense. We would assert that it's a very conscious thing. I'll just bring up, I want to bring up, I'm going to be really short. There's two memos. Well, first there's a memo that was published. It's on the Final Cause website. And a lot of people say that it's not real. But the Final Cause published it, and a lot of people know about it. It's allegedly a 1978 memo, the National Security Council Memorandum 46. And I, don't really, so National Council Security Memorandum 46 is talking about, how many people have heard about that? It's talking about Black Africa and the Black movement in the United States. Anybody know about this memo or heard of it, or the alleged memo? And so one of it, it's asserting that, just in short, that needs to be a concerted effort by the U.S. government to keep separate our movements and our understanding, the people, African people within the United States and African people in what they call Black Africa, right? And it outlines a whole bunch of stuff. If it ain't real, you need to read it because it sure sounds real. I mean, like it's how they read it. And anybody who reads memorandums from, Security Council and knows how they're worded, it's believable. Right, and there was this whole thing about Zygmunt. It's supposed to be authored by Zygmunt Brzezinski. At least his hand is in it, right? And so that we know that was real. What his role he was playing during that time under the Carter administration, right? But he also denies that it's happened. It came out. It was also published in the New African magazine. And then Zygmunt Brzezinski wrote to them. It was kind of, I remember this because I also wrote a little letter to the editor. And before in coma, it's kind of like, I wrote it at the same time that Zygmunt Brzezinski was writing his complaint and saying he was going to jam them up, like I think sue them, and implying that he was going to sue them for it. And he was like, your letter's not coming at a good time. And he ended up publishing both. But it calls the reason that if you think about it, everything, all the recommendations that it talks about doing, we need to take up. And there are two memos that are not National Security Council memorandums, National Security Study Memorandums 200, and then National Security Study Memorandum 201. National NSSM 200 is worried about the explosion in the world population, and particularly the non-white world, and what that means to U.S. interests. And they study it, and they particularly talk about Africa and those kind of things. And it also, so that's one thing. And I'm leading up to why things like AFRICOM or AFRICOM itself is important in the disposition of Africa. And the other memorandum, 201, sets the policy for dumping small arms into Africa, selling and proliferating. And the memorandum is very clear. It acknowledges that skirmishes or conflict, military conflict within the continent of Africa is really not existent. It's not something. So that's not why they did it, to help them protect each other from each other. How we're supposed to be seen as savages who can't get along. But it actually goes into what we see, and it's also a counterpart here. What we've seen in Africa, what we see now, where it's spun in the media, and when I say media, not just news and everything, as the savage people, the warlords, and all that kind of stuff. They're fighting each other and destabilize. Africa's so destabilized because we can't. Same kind of, when we think about it, same thing that happened here. Dumping arms into our communities in Africa, along with cocaine and all that kind of stuff. People know about Gary Webb. And the same propagation in terms of how we're supposed to be seen is put in the same way. Only they don't want us to connect and identify with each other, but subconsciously, because it's a psychological warfare, because we're going to do that anyway, right? We know that Africans, black people in the U.S. came from Africa, right? And so if everywhere you see African people in your neighborhood or over there or in Africa or anywhere else in the black world, it seems like we can't get ourselves together. That induces an inferiority complex. And it induces superiority complexes in those who also look at it, right? And it justifies militarizing. So so now we're leading up to AFRICOM. So Africa's so destabilized, they established the Africa Command. You gotta, do the African Command, and I won't go into exactly everything here because our other speakers will do. And you have the fact sheet of when it happened and on what the mission is and supposed to be. But let's suffice it to say they're trying to save Africa. We need the West to save us because we really don't have the same counterpart program. Now listen, it's 1033 program. How many people have heard of the 1033 program? Any of those of you who haven't heard of the 1033 program, it authorizes state and local law enforcement to get equipment from military-grade equipment from the unused equipment. So they militarize and occupying our communities under the same also because we can't get it together. The drug war, you know, and so this is we have to be seen. We have to understand this from this particular point. I want to read some. I think it's a memo. I know I got it from a government website. I don't remember the Justice something. And it says the 1033 program has allowed law enforcement agencies to acquire vehicles, land and air and sea. Now, I don't know what Chicago or, you know, D.C. would be needing with that, but land, air, and sea weapons, computer equipment, fingerprint equipment, night vision equipment, radios and television, first aid equipment, tents and sleeping bags, and photographic equipment, and more. Now, why? I mean, and so 1033 program goes back about 1997. Is that right? I don't have the year here. 1997, but a lot of its popularity came when it really started, you know, being put to use in Ferguson. So we know why they're doing it. It ain't to help us save us from ourselves. It's to contain our movements, right? And so we can see that the same thing is in Africa when we talk about AFRICOM in Africa. The one thing, and I'm almost got. Let me make sure I'm getting all my points because I'm just talking around. Law enforcement, yes. 1033 program, and then there's all kind of other predecessor programs to 1033, and what you call spin-offs to it, like 1122 that talks about the drug war and being able to get drug enforcement equipment and all those kind of things here. But I'll end with this in terms of the importance of AFRICOM. And where we saw resistance to AFRICOM. In there, it talks about the resistance to AFRICOM initially when it was suggested. It met fierce resistance. It was led by some countries, and in particular, Zimbabwe is listed. And then Zimbabwe in southern Africa, because that's the part of Africa that really had to initiate an armed struggle in order to get its independence. And that's not the only place, but that's where the frontline states where the armed struggle was most important. And after independence and after some of those things were established, that also formulated the kind of cooperation we see in the Southern African Development Community and those kind of things. Cooperation that also has taken the form of military cooperation. And in Zimbabwe, I think in particular, one, because I've done a lot of study around Zimbabwe, but it's also, I think it's an example in the sense of, one, it's been recently in the news. You've seen Zimbabwe, a change in the news. But during the height of U.S. imperialists and Britain's aggression against Zimbabwe, and they, you know, it was about the land, and they were seizing land violently from white farmers and all that kind of stuff. But what we didn't hear is the kind of cooperation that was being led by Zimbabwe, which actually was chairing the Southern African Development Community at that time. And so what AFRICOM, and I think we need to look at Zimbabwe very carefully right now, because what we see there, one of the interests that they have is not just what the typical imperialist interests are. We exploit your land. I'll be less than that right now. Land and labor, but also break up your cooperation, break up your ability to resist, right? And so if they can destabilize or take over Zimbabwe, and then one of the things about Zimbabwe is that its military, it's one of the most standing up against most, taking the most strong stand against imperialism in Southern Africa, at least recently. And so if you can, do something about that, then you actually have a way to come in and solidify your military and dominance over the rest of Africa that you haven't really been able to establish. And so that's why I think looking at Zimbabwe is key. And I'm going to end with three recommendations, or what I would call action steps, and it's kind of not there. One is that we need to build a black identity that is also African over an American identity. I know some people will say that, African American and all. I think it's important for us to actually give deference to, even to the name. I don't even say American. I mean, I'm like Malcolm X on that one. But it creates a refusal to enlist, and the military's here. It creates a stand against imperialism in Africa, and thank you. And then the second one is the new generation of African youth, and this is a note we want to take this. The new generation of African youth is not as susceptible to the divide and conquer things like around immigration and whatnot. And one is because there are a lot of second generation Africans who are immigrants who've come here, and they all, whether you've got here through your people through the transatlantic slave trade or whatever, they're mixing and mingling and identifying and socializing and concretizing a theory and a philosophy when it comes to social justice. And so we're not as acceptable to the immigration things and things like that. And then lastly, so we need to encourage that, and we need to learn from the younger people. And lastly is the specific campaign. Oh, one more. I'm sorry, I got two more. Specific campaign likened to, this is a little campaign likened to you go to a business and they say, are you a active military vet? Because they're going to give you a discount or something like that. We should get businesses who are open to it to give discounts to people who are from countries that are directly occupied by U.S. imperialism, or from and people whose family have been directly impacted by police brutality and aggression. I like put that out there as a propaganda point, as a campaign. And lastly, also people. So we need to also get there's and this is the last thing for real. The Black Lives Movement for Black Lives, as part of their policy platform our policy platform that somebody mentioned, has in it community control of the police, a campaign, which also PACA is doing in D.C. We're trying to ways that we should work with those who are actually really doing something around community control of the police, not police review boards or citizen review, anything. Community control over the police. We can talk about that later, what it means. And we should actually encourage those movements to talk about the synonymous nature of AFRICOM and the 1033 program. Make that part of that thing, so kind of broaden our perspective in terms of internationalizing and Pan-Africanizing everything. Thank you.
I think it's important for you to briefly take a look at the mission of AFRICOM, how it's structured. But let me read what appears to be the main reason why the U.S. created that African Command. This is from Peter Pram, who was an advisor to AFRICOM in 2007 and 2008. And he says that AFRICOM was established for protecting access to hydrocarbons and other strategic resources which Africa has in abundance, a task which includes ensuring against the vulnerability of those natural riches and ensuring that no other interested third parties, such as China, India, Japan, or Russia, obtain monopolies or preferential treatment. So it's about controlling natural resources on the African continent. The concern about terrorism was only the entry point to allow for the proliferation of that command. Next, we're going to bring to the podium Margaret Kimberley. We mentioned that she is a writer for Black Agenda Report. We strongly encourage you to read that publication. I always say that if you are a progressive or someone who identifies as being a part of the left, if you're not reading Black Agenda Report, then what are you reading? I mean, not only does it provide a perspective from the black left, it provides a perspective that spans the entire world. So we bring to the podium our sister, Margaret Kimberley.
Thank you, Ajamu. Good morning. It's working? You can hear me? Okay, good. Not too close, not too far. We are here today, as you can see, to talk about U.S. military presence in Africa and about the Africa Command. A few months ago, AFRICOM, although the corporate media didn't use the term very much, was very much in the news because of U.S. troop deaths in the country of Niger. Most of the media didn't even know how to pronounce it, but at any rate. But Niger it's one of those places that flies under the radar for most Americans, and that's to say they don't even know that it exists until they find out about some American military activity there. And that's what happened in October, after 4 American soldiers died there. And actually, it was Donald Trump's stupidity and racism which made their deaths a news story. At first, the administration wasn't going to say anything about it. Then he was goaded by someone who suggested, well, he said that Obama didn't call the troops' families and he was going to call their families. But of course, he messed it up. He couldn't even make a decent condolence call to the widow. And that became the news story. The African-American soldier, LaDavid Johnson, he spoke to his widow, and a congresswoman who was a friend of the family overheard the conversation. He was very rude to her. The congresswoman said so. There was all this back and forth, but nobody talked much about Niger, about the fact that there was this huge American presence in this country. There are approximately 800 American soldiers there. There is a drone base there. 2 senators, at least 2, went on record and stated publicly they had no idea there were so many soldiers in this country, Lindsey Graham and Chuck Schumer. And it's hard to know if they're being honest or possibly that they are that stupid. They just vote for stuff and other people take care of it. But this 21st century scramble for Africa, it's not the first, is a result of several events, all of which can be blamed on the United States. And it's this continent's sad role to play in this perpetual war, the war on terror, as it was called after the attacks of 9/11 in 2001. The U.S. Africa Command was officially formed under President Bush in 2007. But of course, the goal is always fighting terrorism. But AFRICOM makes the United States the de facto controller of African military, some 30 nations. It minimizes the influence, as Ajamu just said, of other countries, like namely China, which is coming into Africa with money, but so the U.S. comes in with guns. And fighting terror is the catch-all phrase for promoting American efforts at hegemony. And Niger's role became even more tragic after 2011. And that's because that was the year in which the United States, Barack Obama, and with NATO, and with the help of Islamist groups, destroyed Libya, murdered the president, and changed everything in that region of the continent. Now, this is part of, someone last night was talking about the Project for a New American Century. One of the essential aspects of that project is destroying secular Arab governments. So first it was Iraq, then it was Libya, then they tried with Syria, and Syria is a big question mark, and thank goodness that it is. But the defeat of Libya's army changed a lot. Their arms were captured by groups such that, and those arms went to other countries. So those arms went to Mali. Boko Haram in Nigeria profited from this American aggression. Boko Haram and Al-Qaeda in the Maghreb and others in the region. But the purpose of American intervention is always to sow chaos. That way the military and their partners in crime get to stay in business. So when they say it was a mistake or it didn't turn out the way they wanted, that's because it was bad PR, not because they really cared. And just a little more about Libya. I cannot talk about Libya without saying, quote, "We came, we saw, he died," unquote. And I cannot see Hillary Clinton's face without thinking of those words when she bragged and she laughed about murdering a president, about destroying a country, about setting off a race war. So when you see anything about Libya, enslavement, organ trafficking, people drowning in the Mediterranean as they try to get to Europe, you must think of her and her boss. So Obama says that he regrets not having a plan, and as I just touched on that a little bit, that's phony. But I want to say something. A few days ago, Donald Trump referred to Haiti and some African countries as shitholes, but Obama called Libya the shit show because of the bad PR. He said that he tried to blame Europe. He had excuses for what they did, but always remember things like that. But the issue is never whether things were a mistake or whether they turned out the way some American president claims they wanted things to turn out. We must always be opposed to U.S. interventions, always. There will always be some rationale of a responsibility to protect. That was the lie that they've come up with in the last few years. But they must always be opposed. And we have to talk about the dimension, the international dimensions of imperialism. I said this was not just a U.S. project, but a NATO project. And the then Prime Minister of the UK, David Cameron, and the French President Sarkozy, they all ran to Libya and posed for pictures. Hillary Clinton was there as well, getting their policy to fruition. And U.S. policy towards Africa doesn't deviate from a few principles which I've mentioned. First is to subdue any efforts at true independence. That is to say, socialism, to help their NATO partners like France, in this case. Niger is a former French colony, and many other African countries, and keep any other nations like China from gaining influence. And all of those factors come into play there. After the news story about the death of the American soldiers, I wrote a column in Black Agenda Report, and I called it "AFRICOM is the Question." And I was attempting to broaden the level of discourse, so it wasn't just about what Trump said to the widow or, he was rude to the congresswoman. But I wanted to talk about Congress, about the Congressional Black Caucus, about Congresswoman Wilson and her colleagues. Neither she nor anybody else in the Black Caucus had anything worthwhile or useful to say on the issue of Niger, on the issue of the U.S. presence there and in the rest of the continent. Most of them, like the rest of the Democratic Party, voted for this enormous military budget increase. They gave Trump actually more than he originally asked for. So we have to talk about, and this is an action item, they are phony. They are liars. They are traitors. On the one hand, they'll cry about Obamacare and he's taking stuff away. Well, if you increase the military budget by $80 billion, you're taking away a lot from all of us. You're taking away health care. All of the issues we've talked about, the infrastructure, all of the needs that we have in this country cannot be met if you have people voting to increase the military budget the way they did. And I just wanted to say something about this increase in the military budget, $80 billion. That's the total of Russia's military budget. The increase that we had, the 10% increase, that is all of Russia's military spending. So the CBC didn't question the occupation of Niger and Mali and the rest of those countries in the region. There was no pushback. And this policy, Trump's policy, is not that much different from Obama's, which was not that much different from Bush. Actually, Obama's the one who really ratcheted up AFRICOM. The only issue that changes from president to president is the amount of money spent, the degree of intervention, but the story is the same. And I want to talk more about this responsibility to protect and how it has influenced Africa. I mentioned Libya, Nigeria. In 2014, we all know about the young women, the teenage students who were kidnapped by Boko Haram. And then there was a cry to do something. Now, I'm not trying to minimize what happened to those young women, but we have to be careful that when we want to help people and our motives are good and somebody must do something, it cannot be the U.S. military. It can't be the military of France. As soon as that happened, the leaders of 5 nations in the region, Nigeria, Niger, Chad, Benin, and Cameroon, were all summoned to Paris. Allegedly, they called for the meeting, but they were told to show up there. And the issue was how to increase U.S. and French influence in their region. So Boko Haram actually profited more than anybody. These girls were used as a bargaining chip. They used it to strengthen themselves and other organizations as well. So France controls much of the continent almost as much as it did in the days when these countries were officially colonies. They do it with money. There's a currency, the CFA, that the former French colonies are forced to use. They send their money to Paris. France charges them interest to use their money. Niger has uranium, which is used to power nuclear plants in France. So it's an old story of how stories are kept as shitholes because capitalists in Europe and the U.S. want it to be that way. So I wanted to go back to our representatives in Washington and how little they do, even those who pretend. I said before, the Congressional Black Caucus is mealy-mouthed. They're as bought off as the rest. And I'm going to read briefly a statement they made about Niger. Quote, "Our policy toward Africa should be multidimensional and robust and should utilize all of our foreign policy tools, including diplomacy and development, to their maximum capacity. When defense and diplomacy work in tandem, we will be successful in aiding the second largest continent in the world," unquote. What is that? That's it. Oh, we call for a full investigation into the events, unquote. So that's it. That's all we get from them. So our to-do, my to-do list for you, our homework, collective homework, is to call these people out. We have members of the Congressional Black Caucus like Maxine Waters, who used to be, the caucus was once called the conscience of the Congress. If nobody in Congress said we need to cut the military budget, they would. If nobody talked about leaving Africa alone, they did. But then they became bought off, and people with money did not, there was a time when they were sort of excused, and then they realized, we're like, wait a minute, why are we leaving anybody alone? So now they're as compromised as everyone else. They do what the rest of them do. They do not represent our interests. They act against our interests. About a year ago, when Trump was about to be inaugurated, Congressman John Lewis, who, I don't know who made up this term, civil rights icon, but anyway, he was asked if he thought Trump was a legitimate president, and he said no. And he said he's not legitimate because of Russia. Now, he could have said he was not legitimate because of the Electoral College. He could have said he's not legitimate because of voter suppression. He could have said he's not legitimate because black people's votes are stolen, especially in those 3 states that flipped, but he said nothing like that. So I'm going to wind down now, but I think it's very, very important that we not allow ourselves to be taken in, especially this week. So much has been made of Trump's comments. And we have to be smart. You don't have to say that's okay. Yes, you can. You should condemn such language. But we have to remember what these other people do. He makes things easier for the Democrats. I feel like they pay him to do it. Every time he opens his mouth and says something racist and stupid, they are let off the hook when they jump into the fray and condemn them. And then many of us don't pay attention. Excuse me, pay attention to what they do in reality. So that is, I'm going to wind down now. So thank you all very much.
Excellent.
Thank you, Margaret. And again, we invite you to take a look at that timeline on this fact sheet because you can see how the ideological justifications for doing something in Africa, once they got rid of Libya, resulted in this, a continent that was holding itself in resistance to the expansion of the African Command, ended up in full collaboration with U.S. imperialism. We have to point out that the U.S. presence on the continent is not something that's new, though, with AFRICOM, that people have been suffering and dying for quite some time on the African continent, basically for the last 400 years. But even in the period of so-called anti-colonialism, we had some parts of the African continent that suffered more than others. One of those regions is the Central Africa region, specifically the Democratic Republic of the Congo, a place where literally millions of people have lost their lives, but a place where millions of people around the world know nothing about. We've had the Friends of the Congo as one of the organizations that have been attempting to bring that reality to people around the world. And we bring to the podium one of the organizers of that effort, a brother who's been dedicating himself to educating people about the reality of the African continent and specifically about the situation in the Congo. We bring to the podium brother Maurice Carney.
Good afternoon, everybody.
Good afternoon.
It's a pleasure to be here with you. The conference throughout the weekend. It's been tremendously informative and educational, and I hope to contribute to that effort. It's dealing with the U.S. presence or the U.S. intervention on the African continent. What I hope to do is give you a broad stroke with a particular focus and emphasis on the heart of the African continent. If you look at the map, you can see the Democratic Republic of the Congo and its surrounding countries, which straddle the equator, represents the heart of the African continent. In fact, you can argue that the Congo is the fulcrum on which the African continent swings. And it was central to the carving up of the continent in the 1884-1885 Berlin Conference, where European nations established their spheres of influence in Africa. In fact, not only was it called the Berlin Conference, it was also referred to as the Congo Conference. So, U.S. presence in Africa has reached a crescendo due to certain recent events that Margaret mentioned, with the U.S. soldiers being killed in Niger and the controversy that ensued around David Johnson. And this controversy has sort of pierced the veil of the cloud around the continent in the sense that people are more interested and want to know what's going on. U.S. citizens and even people in the peace and anti-war movement. And this struck me as peculiar because here it is that 4 U.S. soldiers passed in Niger, and because of the stupidity and ignorance of the President of the United States, it became major news. And I said, okay, here it is that from 1996 to the present, an estimated 6 million Congolese have lost their lives as a result to conflict. The United Nations says it's the deadliest conflict in the world since World War II. But I don't recall seeing this kind of an uproar and interest and purchase on the conscience of people about this tremendous loss of life, especially considering that the United States had a role to play in terms of it supporting its client states that triggered the war in Rwanda and Uganda by providing them with arms, equipment, financing. Rwanda has received $1 billion from the United States since 2000. Intelligence. And when some accountability is attempted to be instituted on these countries, the U.S. runs political and diplomatic interference through international bodies like the United Nations. So that struck me. And this window through Niger does not represent the nature or the scope of the intervention that the United States has had on the African continent. As you can see on your fact sheet, for the past decade or so, under the Obama administration, U.S. missions on the continent has increased almost some 2,000%. Within the first year of AFRICOM being formed, October 1st, 2008, where Obama came into office, within that first year, the military presence on the African continent increased some 300%. So we've seen tremendous expansion of U.S. military presence on the African continent. And this intervention on the part of the U.S. has some history. A few days from now, on January 17th, we'll commemorate the assassination of Patrice Emery Lumumba, Congo's first democratically elected prime minister, who was overthrown by the CIA. It's well documented in a book called The Assassination of Lumumba. The CIA chief of station at the time, Larry Devlin, wrote a book with that title, Congo Chief of Station, where he laid out the rationale for overthrowing this democratically elected leader. Lumumba, arguably one of the most important assassinations in the 20th century, is right along the line of the overthrowing of governments, democratically elected governments, that took place in Chile with Allende, or Iran with Mossadegh, Guzman in Guatemala. This is the line. Often when we talk about the intervention on the part of the U.S. in overthrowing democratically elected leaders, Africa is often left out. But Lumumba falls in that pantheon. And recently, within the last few years, the U.S. State Department published declassified documents dealing with the U.S. covert action on the African continent during that period. And at the time, in the 1960s, the covert action on the part of the United States was the largest in the world against the Congo and Lumumba, the first post-independence country that the United States intervened in. And the chief of station, Larry Devlin, said this: we had to overthrow Lumumba, because if we didn't overthrow Lumumba, not only would we have lost the Congo, we'd have also lost all of Africa. So from the Berlin Conference to the centering of the Congo, to the overthrow of Lumumba, we see the centrality of the Congo and its significance to the African continent as a whole. So what you'll notice is that both the conservative forces and revolutionary forces recognize the centrality of the Congo. That's part of the reason why Che went there in 1965, spent 7 months, saw it as a key front in the battle against imperialism. Even though the mission was a failure at that time, the Cubans came back later in the 1970s and 80s and helped to defeat the apartheid regime and US CIA against, in Angola. So there's a book I'll share with you. It's entitled From Congo to Soweto by Henry Jackson, which lays out the US role, intervention in the Congo and Africa in the early 60s. It wasn't just Lumumba that they overthrew. Netfa mentioned earlier in '66 with Kwame, with the coup in Ghana and the overthrow of Kwame Nkrumah, the US was involved. What you'll notice is that the US has a pattern on the African continent, being anti-liberation, right? They were against the frontline states in southern Africa. I shared with you the case in Angola where the CIA was involved and in cahoots with the apartheid state in fighting in the Angolan Civil War. They were against liberation heroes. It was the United States that provided the information that resulted in the arrest of Nelson Mandela. Right. It was the United States that put Nelson Mandela on the US terrorist list, Mandela and the ANC. And even after Mandela got out of jail, it wasn't until 2008, in an attempt to see that he didn't reach his 90th birthday or to remove him from the terrorist list before he passed. That's when he got taken off the US terrorist list. So there has been if you look at the US engagement on the African continent, it's been on the wrong side of history. It hasn't been on the side of democracy, hasn't been on the side of liberation, hasn't been on the side of self-determination. So AFRICOM represents the continuation of this. Now, the destructive role of the United States on the African continent reaches its most insidious level in the Congo, in that the United States supported its client states, its allies, in the triggering of what I shared with you earlier was the deadliest conflict in the world since World War II. And in 1998, when Bill Clinton traveled to the African continent, they had a meeting in Entebbe and in Uganda. And out of this meeting came what is known as the Entebbe Principles. And the Entebbe Principles really draw from the Washington Consensus, and that was established by John Williamson. Washington Consensus has about 10 points. It's firmly ensconced in the neoliberal framework where the U.S. Forces, the U.S. Institutions like the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, they call on African nations to privatize their state assets, invest in cash crops as opposed to subsidies for agriculture, focus more on deregulation, private sector, divest from health, education, and so forth. So a number of leaders at the time, you had figures such as Paul Kagame of Rwanda and Yoweri Museveni of Uganda and Meles Zenawi of Ethiopia, all being embraced around the Entebbe Principles and being championed as the new breed of African leaders, new Pan-Africanists. You had figures like, at the time, Susan Rice was the Assistant Secretary of State for African Affairs, and Madeleine Albright was the Secretary of State. And they held up these leaders as the Renaissance leaders of Africa. And you know what they had in common, in addition to embracing the Washington Consensus and neoliberal principles? They've all invaded other countries. They're authoritarian figures. They got to power through the barrel of a gun. They have the blood of millions of Africans on their hands. So what the US does is it takes these figures who are sociopaths and it brings them here to us and present them as new breed of African leaders, right? And they utilize their experts in crushing their population. And this is where the support of AFRICOM really works against the interests of the masses of Africans. Because these sociopaths are backed up by the US military, they're financed to the hilt with equipment and intelligence in the works, and they use it to crush the progressive social forces inside the country. And Yoweri Museveni of Uganda is an expert at this. And he's opened up his country to the service of the West, not only by invading other countries, as he did with Somalia, that with the Islamic courts in 2006, so where the Islamic courts were stabilizing Somalia, but the U.S. intervened through its proxy in Yoweri Museveni that ultimately produced al-Shabaab and the destructive forces that we see in Somalia. But what Museveni does also is one of the largest exports of Uganda is private military corporations providing people, individuals that are trained by U.S. private military corporations to go where? Iraq, Afghanistan. So they serve as a conduit for strengthening U.S. military presence, not only in Africa, but throughout the globe. So, I know my time is short, so I'm going to have to skip a whole bunch and just get right to the end, where we see the moving from the Entebbe principles of Clinton towards the principle of AFRICOM under Donald Rumsfeld and George Bush. And this represented a significant shift in terms of U.S. moving from proxy forces, client states, to actually having boots on the ground and utilizing an array of elements within its arsenal to achieve that. It's not just a question of U.S. exercising hard power, but as Joseph Nye talks about in his soft power, the U.S. utilizes its soft power to advance its military presence as well, talking about its institutions, National Endowment for Democracy, International Republican Institute, so-called grassroots organizations. I know you all remember Invisible Children in Coney 2012, right? Remember that? One of the major arguments that Invisible Children made, and we battled them in Coney 2012, was for the United States to provide special operation forces to go after Joseph Kony, right? This one individual nobody had seen in ages. And to provide the Ugandan military with more equipment to do that. Does anybody know where those troops are today? Those special forces? You don't know where Kony is. Invisible Children may be out of business, but those special forces are part of the forces that we see in these African countries. They're still there. What are they doing? Who even knows about them anymore? What about all those people who were clamoring around Coney 2012? So let me just bring this to a close, though, in that the rationale for AFRICOM, and the Bush administration was shrewd in laying this out, was for going to build wells, provide humanitarian support, provide human rights training. Now, we know of all the entities in the world, the U.S. military is the least qualified to provide humanitarian training. And they did that in a shrewd way because they put at the head of AFRICOM a homegrown figure from right here in Baltimore, grew up in Baltimore, Kip Ward, graduated from Morgan, a black man. And he was the face of AFRICOM, the vertical advancement of African Americans. So it made it even harder for you made it seem even more fuzzy, so to speak. But the reason why they can able to get away with this and do what they do in Africa, a main reason, not the only reason, but a significant reason nonetheless. And we believe that it comes out of this Hegelian notion of Africa, right? Because Hegel, in his philosophy of history, argued that Africa had no history, right? He said that there were no great wars fought in Africa. No great empires rose and fell like other places. And he even did the intellectual gymnastics of removing North Africa, Egypt, and Northern Africa from Africa as a whole, right? And he said that of Africa, it said it laid beyond the day of history, enveloped in the dark mantle of night. That's what Ego said. And it's because of this notion that we have of the African continent as dark, with figures that are perpetually deemed to internecine tribal warfare, irredeemable souls, right? The Joseph Conrad's heart of darkness. Even though he wasn't talking about Africans when he talked about the heart of darkness, he was talking about the hearts of those colonizers, those who were in service to King Leopold II. So it's this notion that allows us to, or enables us to first get a sense of Africa because of 4 U.S. soldiers, and not because millions of lives have been lost, right? It could happen, millions of lives are lost anywhere else in the world. There would be international outcry. People want to know, how do we stop this? How do we bring this to an end? Especially considering that the modern tools that we use, the coltan and the cobalt, is vital to the functioning of our cell phones and the electric cars that we all drive to express ourselves and support the green energy or green technology, where Congo is the #1 source of cobalt in the world. So here it is that we get these resources to advance our modern society, yet the people who are being crushed as a result of their sitting on that $24 trillion worth of natural wealth are silent. There's not a peep about them. Even if we're concerned about climate change, where the Congo Basin is a part of the 2nd largest rainforest in the world and vital to the fight against climate change, an issue that we all say that we're concerned about. But what about the people who live there? So, the first thing we can do is to radically transform the way we view Africa. Instead of looking at it through the lens and the prism of charity, we need to look at Africa through the prism of justice. And if we do that, then we summon Dr. King, where he said, injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. So that's the first thing that we can do in terms of action and restructure the way we look at the African continent and people of African ancestry. The second is for us to challenge these sociopaths when they come here. They come to our university campuses, they're at Harvard, they're at Yale, they go to Brandeis, Paul Kagame, you name it. They commit crimes in Africa, and they come here to cleanse those crimes on the international level. So each and every one of us can do that. We encourage you to sign up on our email list. You can go to Black Alliance for Peace for sure, certainly on friendsofthecongo.org, and sign up on the email list. We will let you know when it's time to take action when these guys come here, so we can challenge them. Third and final, there are social movements taking place on the African continent, particularly among the youth. And it's vital that we stand in solidarity with them. It's critical that we support their efforts, not just solely out of solidarity, but out of self-interest. We can learn a lot from their movements. I know people talk about the Arab Spring, but let me tell you this. You know, first of all, Tunisia is in Africa. Tunisia is a part of the African continent, and Africa has a rich tradition of resistance, of overthrowing colonialism, only to be come back up on by the French and the US in a violent escapade across the continent to rid the continent of the liberation leaders like Lumumba and Nkrumah and others, and impose the puppets that we see today. So, supporting the youth movements, the social justice movements on the African continent. Today, we see Togo, for example, rising up, trying to get rid of a 50-year dynasty in Ayadema. And do you know what happened during their rise up? The president of Togo, he had organized an Israel-Africa summit in Togo because the Israelis are trying to get a stronger footprint on the African continent to get support. But because there was a resistance movement in Togo, they had to cancel that. So, we'll wrap up right there. That's the third and final one, is solidarity and support of movements on the African continent. Thank you.
All right, thank you. My name is Abdul Shahid Ukman with the Virginia Defenders. And my question is this. Seeing that the United States and Western militarism violently backed its imperialist goals in Africa and black diaspora nations in the Caribbean, as well as being the enforcer through the militarization of police, of its colonization, domestic colonization of black people in the United States, how can we demand an end to these practices without also demanding that reparations be a part of the overall discussion?
Please comment, Maurice, on China's role in the African continent today.
As a person who's participating in the anti-apartheid movement, I want you all's opinion about the fact that one of the things we did was made an effort to go out on college campuses and share the information and get them involved as they and that's back in the 70s. By the time of the 80s, you end up having the resources from those student organizations that help build the anti-apartheid movement today. And is that not a means of which we need to do today, especially in this room? I'm sure that many people have children and grandchildren that are still on those college campuses, that still have access to those student activity fees, and could be very useful in getting the word out, because these are going to be the people that are going to be the new leaders of this country. And if we're going to build a movement towards peace, is that not a good place to start?
Just is not directly related to this plenary. I just wanted to note that as a solution to the issue about the lack of diversity, we could offer diversity grants to come to this conference and have people apply, whether they're low income, youth, people of color, different sexual orientations, gender expressions, and just ask them what would they offer as a what would they do with the information and the connections that they would make at this conference if they came?
Thank you.
You said, how can it not be part of the conversation? It should be part of the conversation. I mean, I don't see how it cannot be part of the conversation. In fact, part of the conversation around reparations should be, what are reparations? How do we see it? And we feel that things like, and also the Movement for Black Lives platform talks about reparations. People should understand that. But it's a lot, as a topic around us, there's a lot of different perceptions of what that means and what it would take. Some argue, and I'm not suggesting this, that we can't expect the nature of this imperialist capitalist system to ever repair or do anything that would give up and sacrifice, but it doesn't mean that there's not something actually quite valuable and necessary in the movement for reparations. Community control of the police. One, it should be about shifting power. So when we talk about shifting power, that's the repairing. That's repairing our. So that's the short answer. If I can, should I? No, that's it. Go. Okay, just the other questions. So you said the role of China. I think China is very significant in also understanding the assault on Zimbabwe and in the southern Africa, because one of the things that Zimbabwe did that was to the ire of the West was it's a lot consolidated. One, it has a long history with China anyway, a long relationship, and its relationship in terms of helping it become independent and whatnot. And so when Zimbabwe incurred the ire of the West for initiating its fast-track land program and abolishing the structural adjustment programs that the IMF and World Bank imposed on it, it lifted up what they call their Look East policy. And so it wasn't just China, but China was a very main partner in trying to help consolidate, for trying to help Zimbabwe withstand the sanctions and everything else that was happening there. So I think one of the things, and I guess maybe I can leave that to the rest of the other people, but China is not, it doesn't have the kind of conditions that the West has when it comes. It's not about domination. There's a lot much more. I mean, of course, it has its own interests, and no one should be have any illusions about that. But they're not going to try to occupy your country. They're not going to leverage structural adjustment programs on you and all those other kind of things. So it should be, if the African continent is to look at trying to have any type of viable cooperations and trade or any kind of relations with other places, then it's something that's a legitimate option for us to look at. The other question was about the schools. I got mixed feelings about that because my history comes out of the All African People's Revolutionary Party. That was what we did, build campus bases. And I still think it's a legitimate, I don't think we should not do it. But I think, particularly with the time of the rise of the movement for Black Lives Matter as a movement, one of the things I think that's heavily on, it's a heavily more privileged, more educated of our Africans. It just seems that way to me. And I think one of the things we do is that really it needs to be a stage in our development. It don't need to be it. And so at some point, this is not a disagreement. I think it's important that we look at the college campuses and everything, but we have to be very conscientious and intentional about when our movement will be able to disperse into the broader, most impacted of our people. I think that's a failure if we only look at them and think that, because there's an issue of class struggle within our community. We have to deal with the perceptions of privilege and class and how people see all that. And so the most impacted people who don't even necessarily have the formal education need to be in the forefront of applying their creative genius, which people have, and understanding the problems and coming up with the solutions that plague us. And then yours speaks for itself. Thank you for that. Black working, yes, that's what I mean. The black working class, and then you're right. Let's define it. So the black working class, and we need to redefine. I can't remember how he did it, but Brother Kali Akuno in Cooperation Jackson gave a really good definition of so we're re-understanding working class. So it even includes people who are subject to having to sell their labor, even in fact you ain't being able to sell it at any point. So the unemployment people who are unemployed or anyone, you're part of that working class. If you're not, say it again. Sex work. Anybody who does not have access or the privilege to this capitalist system, and even if you're not really selling anything, you're homeless or whatever, you're still part of work class. So that's the most impacted people.
One of the demands we need to make is on our elected officials. I was trying to touch on that. We have to not only stop supporting, voting for, giving money to people who vote to increase military budgets, but we must actively oppose them as well. And that has to be one of our demands. We have to get rid of these people who are so damaging to all our communities, but especially for Black people. We refer to the Black misleadership class, politicians and others who act against us all the time on a regular basis. And one of our demands has to be that they go. But that means that others of us have to step up. And Netfa was touching on that. We need to bring more people in. We have to, Julie touched on it as well with her question. It can't be top down. Okay, let's get some young people. All right, let's get some working people in here. Well, you have to include people first and talk about things they want to talk about and show them the connections between this effort to cut government funding, except for defense. So that is how I see the issue of demands.
Just quickly on China, the Chinese presence on the African continent is one of the rationales the unstated rationales for AFRICOM, as Ajamu read to you Peter Pam's statement around that. And Chinese have over $200 billion worth of trade with the African continent. In the Congo, for example, when the Chinese had a $9 billion deal on the table, they got a lot of pushback from the International Monetary Fund, from the World Bank, Paris Club, where they had to renegotiate the deal. Actually, IMF forced the Congolese government to renegotiate its deal with the Chinese. It held up a $600 million package that it had for the Congolese government until that deal was renegotiated. So the Chinese, because the U.S. cannot compete, or Europe for that matter, with the Chinese economically, that's where we see the advance, where the U.S. is protecting its interests, strategic interests through its military. So it's probably one of the biggest takeaway from the Chinese presence on the African continent. How it has caused the United States to respond.
Pat Elder, studentprivacy.org. I would imagine the U.S. soldiers deployed in bases affiliated with AFRICOM are disproportionately African American and economically disadvantaged. Does your work include countering the recruitment of these youth from our high schools? American imperialism starts in our high school cafeterias and school offices. The empire is vulnerable on this strategic front, just to anyone. Thank you.
Right behind you.
Thank you very much for a great panel. My questions are, what is the role of evangelical Christianity, both in the domestic front and in Africa? And what about Susan Rice and her people's investments in Congo and all that involvement? Thanks.
Ifia Wangaza from the Black Alliance for Peace and Malcolm X Center for Self-Determination, WMXP Community Radio, and I point out to you that we've been broadcasting the conference for the past 2 days. As a former member of Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, SNCC as it's commonly called, I would say to young people, and folk who persist in bemoaning the absence of larger numbers of young people, is that one, young people have a responsibility to organize themselves and to bring other young people along. I'm not prepared as an elder to assume responsibility for more young people not being here. Nor am I prepared to be responsible for the not being greater racial or class diversity. I think that Ajamu is to be applauded for his unending effort, and I've worked with him for 15, 20 years, and he has been a stalwart in promoting diversity, and I think that he's to be applauded for bringing it to this situation. But he can't do it by himself, and so each of us who think that that's essential need to put our shoulders to the wheel and to advance that issue. I wanted to say also with regard to media is to stop relying so heavily on the corporate media and to develop our own media. I can remember the days when there were newspapers, there were street corner events, there was theater, there were movies such as we could create them in order to get our message out. That may mean that the old heads of us who are here are funding the young people who are already doing those things.
Okay.
I want one last thing, and that's with regard to China. China is not a saint. It's not in Africa. It's not in the Caribbean. It's not anywhere because of any great altruism or largesse. Everywhere it is, people are complaining about the violations to culture, to land, to the same kinds of experiences that people in this country are experiencing under the rubric of gentrification, which I call anglicization or more cannibalization. People in Africa are complaining that farmland is being eaten up by China and people are being pushed into the cities and unable to survive. I think that we need to look at China more objectively.
Hello, thank you. My name is Robin Lloyd. I'm on the Disarm Committee of the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom. We proposed a women's session, a women's workshop here, and I must say I'm disappointed that there hasn't been more focus on women's activities, women's strengths, and so often it's women as having been raped or violated. The Women's International League has a number of sections now in Africa. One of them is in the Congo, and we're going to hold our first Congress ever in Ghana next summer. What I'd like to point out to everyone is that we have issued a statement about Djibouti. No one's mentioned Djibouti. This is an incredible place on the Red Sea. It is where there are bases of the United States, China, France, Japan, Saudi Arabia, and Italy, all cheek by jowl together in this tiny little country. Now, when they start making war with each other elsewhere, how are they going to, I mean, how many listening devices exist in Djibouti to listen to the other guy, you know? We've issued a statement called Remote Warfare and Sexual Violence in Djibouti. I think, I recommend that. I think you can find that on the internet. And this is a country where the government receives $300 million a year in rent from all these places, and it's the last rating country in effectively combating human trafficking. So that's basically all I want to say. Also, I'm from Burlington, Vermont, and we have a media center there called towardfreedom.com, and it's alternative news of world news. So I invite you to go to that website. Thank you.
I'd like to address the question about military recruitment. One of the things that saddened me so much about the death of the African-American soldier, LaDavid Johnson, was that black people joined in using the same retrograde language. He died for his country. He was a patriot. Not that this young man worked at Walmart before he joined the Army. That's why you join the Army, because you can't get a living wage job. So I think that's an important part of our activism is to do away with this language and do away with this way of thinking that says anything positive about all these things that we are told are good, like joining the military. And I'm not condemning people who, because they've joined the military, but it's a part of and I think that's the answer to our outreach issues and other things we've talked about, is joining together all of these issues. The need for a living wage, the need for good education, the need for so many things for socialism that would end this imperialism that has all these dots in the map of. I realized I was trying to find Uganda on the map, and there's so many dots I could hardly see it. So that, I think, that's my response to the issue of recruitment.
I concur with everything Margaret said, but I would also add that we really need to, and our people, mostly when it comes to the military, it's the poverty draft, like Margaret said. But in addition to political education, mass political education, of understanding all of these dynamics, how they play, we're going to have an aversion to the Army. But we need to also figure out how to harness our resources so that we can materially meet the fundamental needs of the people, so they don't have to do certain things like that. And so it comes along with the mass political education and the consciousness raising and the interconnecting of the dots. But we really gotta, while we're trying to fight capitalism, we got to be building the alternative, and we got to be harnessing our resources and community control. When we say that, we don't just mean the police. We're talking about community control of land, our economies, all that kind of stuff. Putting some cooperatives together so we're not replicating capitalist models, but having the people kind of, be in charge of the solutions themselves. Maybe you can.
Just quickly, as it relates to the evangelicals on the continent, I highly recommend that you look at the book by Jeff Sharlet. It's called The Family, The Secret Fundamentalism at the Heart of American Power. It talks about the cabal of members of Congress who make up the family, and especially their relationship with Uganda and the role that they've played in supporting Yoweri Museveni, actually being engaged in Ugandan internal affairs and having an undue influence in policies that, in legislation that's been introduced to deal with anti-gay laws that's been introduced in Uganda. So there's a very powerful cabal of members of Congress who are deeply involved in on the African continent, particularly in East Africa and Uganda. But that book, The Family, The Secret Fundamentalism at the Heart of American Power, would be a good source to Jeff Sharlet. Jeff Sharlet.
We're going to have 1 minute of a sum up per person, starting with Margaret, and then we're in. Margaret?
Okay, great. Okay, I'll just repeat some of what I said. We have to actively oppose people in our government. We cannot let Donald Trump give Democrats a get-out-of-jail-free card. That is my sum up on this issue and many other issues. These people promote terrible things. Most of them have better sense than to be vulgar in public, but they're vulgar in private, and they have destroyed millions of lives all around the world, and we cannot let them off the hook because Trump is the president.
Thank you.
I guess the only thing I would say is that when I hear people talking about people on the left, well, I would say the left like us. I usually don't like to, think of it as this monolithic. It's the left here and the right over here. It's actually a spectrum. But often, and this is what Pan-Africanism is trying to address as a movement, that's very at least 100 years old and some, is what I call the ideological schizophrenia that exists. Sometimes people say, we bombed Iraq, when you disagree in it, we bombed it. Well, what we really need to address where our I think, an understanding of where our principles, how our principles, our values, and our actions come together and should be redefining our identity. We talk about this as a settler colony. How much of that negates the indigenous people? How much do we talk about we and America and trying to make America do the right thing. Well, what is America? That's why I call it an oxymoron. So I think we need to, it's not just black people that have the schizophrenia. I think we need to really unpack some of the stuff that will help us get to a lot of the, the solutions that we need to.
Thank you.
Just quickly, I would say that, and an encouraging note, that we continue to expand the space and include Africa in the exchange, the dialogue, the discourse, the organizing. I think it's critical that the African continent, I know Africa is a big place, but the range of countries on the continent to be included. I think that would be a huge step forward. I believe there's space for that with the peace community, anti-war community, and the left in general. And secondly, just reiterate the lens through which we look at the continent, that we shift and push for a different way of looking at the African continent. And I think that can help in overall organizing and political education. And then finally, again, the appeal to seek out, and Ajamu mentioned Black Agenda Report, and of course there's Black Alliance for Peace. Seek out those social justice movements on the African continent and find ways to support them. I highly encourage that. And on those
Please join me in thanking our panelists for this afternoon. We also want to thank Leah for her thankless job of keeping us on time. And thank all of you